Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 276. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today, I'm here with my favorite jiu-jitsu phenom and tiger mom, Emily Kwok. How's it going, Emily?
It's going okay. I mean, I like that you can use my favorite and add like 2, 3, 4, 5 things on the end because then everyone can be your favorites.
Absolutely. I was talking to Stefan about this, right? I mean, if you narrow your focus enough in terms of how you describe things, everyone can be the best in the world at something. You just have to narrow that descriptor down.
100%. You're very clever, Steve. I'm glad to be back on here. It's been a while.
I am always glad to have you here. I mean, people on our premium service probably are well acquainted to listening to you. You've got the highest levels, an amazing podcast that you do with Joe Hannon on our Mental Models premium service. So definitely not a stranger to the premium listeners, but for everyone else, quick life update. How have things been since the last time we talked?
We've had a lot happening. For those humans that don't know, in September, I took a leap of faith with the support of my community at Princeton BJJ and moved my family to Costa Rica. Why would we do something like this? Some people can understand it. Other people are like, what? Life is definitely not as frictionless, you could say, or easy in some ways. Like we don't have Amazon Prime and there's no drive-through and there's no DoorDash. And, you have to drive 2.5 hours to the closest thing that resembles Costco or Walmart. But in terms of quality of life, it's been really amazing to be close to the water. I'm trying to become a better surfer. I'm trying to learn not to fight everything, but to embrace and harness energy that we can't manage. And that's kind of the art of being in the ocean, I feel like. I think I needed to sort of evolve the way that I was leading and working with people. I didn't realize in so many ways that I was the reason why my school or my people, I think, couldn't step up. It's like when Mama Bear is there, everyone kind of looks to you and everyone thinks that you're going to be the one to do the thing or fix the thing. And although that's wonderful to have your community support you and respect you on that level, for me, I was so eager to see people grow and evolve and step up into more leadership opportunities. And it was the scariest thing to break apart something that I know is very dear and sensitive to a lot of people, including myself. But it has been the most liberating thing. I'm so proud of my staff and my crew. I'm so proud of my students. In many ways, when we started the school, the idea was to create the type of sustainable environment that was hard for me to see. I'm sure a lot of students out there some people are probably in great situations where they have a really supportive school and network around them. And other ones, head instructor gets burnt out or the culture is a little political or dicey. It can be rough. And I wanted to create something sustainable and I wanted to create something that was opt-in and participatory. And we really have that. And I think we have it because I left and said, hey, let's do this together. And so I make periodic trips back. I have a really great crew of people that are taking on different roles and learning to grow together. And sure, it was a bit janky in the beginning. We certainly had to work out some systems, but it's a really good feeling when you choose to make a leap and the wind comes into your sails and you realize it was the right thing to do. And it was not just right for you, but in many ways, it was actually right for everybody. So life is good, super intense, but really, really beautiful. Thanks for asking.
That's always one of the hardest things about leadership is moving away from that command and control, all things must route through me, top-down model towards stepping back and letting the next generation rise up and take that spot over. That's one of the hardest things to do. Of course, everyone's always worried that it's going to go sideways. And I mean, a lot of the time it does. It's hard for the ego as well. I've certainly had this as well, where you don't want to step away from something because it feels nice to be essential, even if it's not the optimal solution. But a big part of maturing as a leader is making a system where it's not dependent on you. And in fact, it can thrive and even be better without you than it was with you. That's always a sign of maturity, but it's very hard to do. Probably actually touches on what we were planning to talk about today, which is polarities. And I'd love to explain this. We've kind of been brainstorming about doing an episode on this, or maybe even a whole series on this at some point, Emily. Why don't you go ahead and just introduce the concept here so everyone understands what we're going to be attacking today?
Yeah, I'd love to. And you read my mind because I was like, oh, this is a great segue for us to talk about our topic. So polarity management was something that I was introduced to in I always call it my professional career, but I guess jiu-jitsu is also my profession, but like my non-jiu-jitsu career, or I should say paved by jiu-jitsu, which is in the performance work that I do, largely with founders and elite minds and, people that work in a executive fashion. And in that world, I get introduced to a lot of wonderful specialists and therapists and coaches and minds. And one of them you had on your podcast some years ago named David Zeitler, who is a specialist in the adult developmental world. And I started working with David in a professional capacity. We would sometimes bring him on as a consultant for some work. And Josh Waitskin, who many of your listeners follow the work of, including some of your wonderful guests, Josh and I have had a very intimate relationship for over 14 years and had suggested to me some time ago that our genius often lies right next to our funk. And it's usually the other side of the coin. And we can either be aware of it and sort of see how it plays into our life, or it can kind of control us. And he had recognized something in my personality where he said, you're one of the most brilliant executors I've ever seen. You get shit done, like on a level that is abnormal. Like most humans don't work that way. And at the same time, I think it's really closely related somehow to this impatience that you have with some people. So like when his nickname for me is Gumpy, which I think I've said to your listeners before, but it's 50% grumpy, 50% gumption. When Gumpy sort of hits the wall with certain people, I really lose my patience. And it's kind of like, I feel like I have an inner Muppet character living inside of me that just kind of steams up like animal and gets crazy when certain people push my buttons, usually with behavior that tends to be a little bit like self-absorbed or arrogant. And he said, you don't have to. But if you would like to take this on, like if you'd like to, maybe see what's behind it, I'd love to support you getting some coaching from David. And I was like, yeah, I'm game. I'd love to figure out why I have that impatience, and I'd love to not feel that way so much. And so David engaged with me on a number of things, psychological frameworks that I could take on. And one of the things that came up in our work was called polarity management. And it was, I believe, brought to the mainstream by a doctor by the name of Barry Johnson in the mid to late 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And it sort of presents this idea that there are many problems in life that we can't solve. So, for example, simple problems like 2 + 2 = 4, like that's pretty absolute. Or if I'm baking or if I'm, making food, the recipe calls for X, Y, Z. Like if you don't put these things in, like if the problem is that your cake didn't rise, it's probably because you missed this ingredient. So problems are things that we have distinct answers to. But the reality is most things in our life are not that simple. And a lot of things in our life are actually far more complex. And when we can't solve a complex problem, we have this idea of introducing polarities or polarity management. So it's not an either or solution. It's not like, well, either you forgot this or you put that in, but it's more so an and. So one of the most basic models here is that breathing has to be a polarity. You must have oxygen and you must have CO2 in order to have the function of breathing. You can't have one without the other. So polarities don't work when you say, let me think of a good one that people will get wrong. holding things lightly and or holding them for a long time. Okay. It sounds like it could be a polarity, but it's really more like holding things lightly or letting them go. And what that does is it kind of creates a tension around the dynamic of holding things lightly or letting them go. And we have to think about what we want as a higher level goal. So holding things lightly or letting them go. What's the best outcome if you learn how to manage holding something lightly or letting it go? Well, maybe you have a more reasonable response, right? What's the worst thing that could happen if you don't hold things lightly or if you don't let things go? Well, you could become like a crazy, resentful, human and do some terrible things because you're just out of control. Another way of looking at it is, this was a polarity that I worked on for myself, the self or the group, right? So it's not just the self and the self or, the self now and the self 5 years later. It's like the self or the group. These two things usually have to live together. And what is the tension between them? What happens when both of those things are integrated and they work very well? Well, you can have harmonious culture and a human can feel like they're a part of things very actively. If you don't have a harmonious tension between the self and the group, you could have ostracization, you could have bullying mentality, like you could have a lot of terrible things happen to the culture. People feel left out, everything kind of feels disjointed. And so the idea of polarity management is learning to map out the upsides and the downsides of these two values that we'll have. And when we map out the upsides and the downsides, we can become much more objectively aware of why we want to be living in one part or the other. So a polarity map looks like a quadrant generally. There are the upsides of both values. So like, let's say the self and the other. So on the upsides of investing in the self, the upside of investing in groups, and then we have the downside of investing in groups and the downside of investing in the self. And the way a polarity management map works is we start to articulate all of the different outcomes that we can see in any of these quadrants. And as we recognize them, it helps us become more aware of when something is out of balance or out of flow. The rotation or the movement of the outcomes within a polarity map usually kind of takes the form of a figure 8. So if you're kind of stuck on the downside of something, like let's say you're stuck on the downside of the self, and so you're becoming selfish, or you're becoming super isolated, or you're becoming super aggressive with people, and you recognize this in yourself, then part of the way that you get yourself out of that state is you look to the upside of the opposite quadrant, which is the upside of the group. And what are some of the good things that come out of being in a group? Camaraderie, maybe sharing, things like collaboration and creativity. So we teach ourselves to look for those types of outcomes, and then we can assign actions and behaviors to help us do those things so that we pull ourselves out of these negative states.
I'll just add here that people might listen to this and think, hey, what's this have to do with jiu-jitsu? And
Yes.
I would say that there's actually a lot that has to do with jiu-jitsu, because polarities can be used not just as a tool for understanding your personality or for solving problems on the job. They can also be used to understand the nuance that is involved in jiu-jitsu. And I bring this up because there's a lot of things in jiu-jitsu that sometimes get presented as absolutes or either or. And one of the things I like about thinking in terms of polarities is when you realize that things are not as simple sometimes as yes or no, either or. Sometimes you realize that things are a spectrum. And there are times when you might want to be on one side of that spectrum and times when you might want to be on the other side. A good example I can give has to do with, for example, tension. We've talked about this a lot. There are times when you want to be loose, and you will often hear people say, hey, you want to be loose when you're doing jiu-jitsu. You want to be relaxed. And that's good advice for a white belt who is likely overly tense. But there are also times when you want tension, particularly when you're trying to apply force in a certain way. If you're going for a big power throw, there's a time where you have to snap and kind of crack that whip and be tense, because that's where your force and your power comes from. So it's not as simple as a yes or a no. And there's also times where you might be tense in some ways, but loose in other ways. It isn't as simple as saying be loose all the time or be tense all the time. Similarly, other examples. I mean, if you want to get more technical, how many instructors out there have told their students, never cross your ankles when you're on someone's back? Well, I understand where that advice comes from, but there are many, many counterexamples that prove that wrong. So I think the big thing about polarities is it teaches people to think with more nuance and to look at things on a spectrum rather than as yes or no.
100%. And it also it helps you paint out the fact that there are so many options. Like jiu-jitsu is just so many different systems that have been interconnected together, and it gives you the flexibility and the framework to move and manage all of these outcomes and options, if you will, rather than to just invest in one thing. And the reason why I started thinking about polarity management in jiu-jitsu was because over the years teaching, not only have I taught many humans and been in many taught at many seminars, but I have also been the student many times in different settings and also had the privilege of working with other high-level athletes. And one of the things that I started really thinking about recently, thematically, was more so this idea of the quality of movement. And a lot of people would come to me and ask for a private lesson, and they'd say, well, can you fix my jiu-jitsu? And I would train with them and, I'd say, your jiu-jitsu is not really broken. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. This is very typical, sort of like a blue belt or a purple belt coming who knows enough jiu-jitsu to roll with you. And then they're just like, how come I don't get anything? Or, I know this move, but it never shows up. And more often than not, I was finding that it wasn't a result of them not knowing the technique well. Like, it wasn't the mechanics of the technique, but it was more so that there were these other elements that as a practitioner, as an athlete, I do and I can feel that they were completely lacking. And by bringing some awareness to their quality of movement, all of a sudden it would change the dynamic of their technique, right? And so I started paying attention. For one of the biggest ones that came out to me in the beginning was tension and slack. You don't, to your point, you talked about a spectrum. You cannot have a successful outcome if you have no tension and you have no slack. They need to be employed in such a way where it allows you to manage and control the movement of the other person. If you have too much slack and zero tension, you're a wet noodle. If you have too much tension and not enough slack, you're a piece of plywood and you're going to break, or you're going to break somebody else. And so it was like helping people understand how to slide up and down this spectrum of how and when you could employ tension, how and when you should introduce slack to make your movement more successful. And, you think about going fast and slow. Like, you need to have both of these things in place in order to have great jiu-jitsu. You can't just be slow all the time. Sometimes your timing has to, you have to pick up the pace. And these were often values that were not taught. And it made me think about the fact that as teachers, whether it's we just haven't gotten there, teaching hasn't evolved to this place, or maybe we're still going through cycles of figuring it out, we don't teach a lot of this. Like, we just take for granted. I think it's because we do it. So we're like, oh, well, of course people can feel the tension when I do this lasso sweep. But you realize when you're teaching a new student, you can't take for granted that they know how much tension you should have or how much slack you should have. And we don't really explain this. A lot of us in our teaching, we don't really talk about these values. We just demonstrate the movements. We demonstrate the 1, 2, 3. There's a manual. But once you introduce values, it brings a different quality to how you do something. And I find that once you introduce that, people have so much more success doing what they do. And then the light bulb goes off and they're like, oh man, like nobody ever showed this to me before. And I thought, yeah, like, why don't we show that? And I think it's because when we introduce values, it's really about talking about complex systems that we have to start managing. And it's not as simple as a literal, here's how you do this choke, 1, 2, 3, right? Like, that's the problem that you solve. I want to choke this person unconscious. Well, 1, 2, 3, here's what you do. Like, how and when do you introduce it? And how hard and how soft should it be? And like, what entry do you use? And so as I was going through this personal process of working through polarity management on myself, I said to David, I was like, could this work with jiu-jitsu? And he's like, I don't practice jiu-jitsu, but I'm pretty sure it will, because you're managing complex problems, right? Or like complex systems. And I was like, So I think that's when I had started talking to you about it. I spoke about it at 1 or 2 seminars. People are quite intrigued by the idea. And like, when we talk about how do you do this in jiu-jitsu, I guess that's what today's introductory episode dedicated to polarity management is about. We're gonna try and figure it out.
Absolutely. Well, I can definitely tell you, at least from my own personal experience, that this stuff definitely does exist in jiu-jitsu, and it definitely does work and matter. And a big part of that is for the reasons that you brought up. A lot of these ideas that we have in jiu-jitsu, they only make sense relative to the other end of the spectrum. You brought up, for example, tension and slack. If you're always one of those and never the other, then that doesn't really have any meaning. Let me give you an example here. Something that we've talked about on the podcast many times is this idea of staying coiled up and coiling your limbs, right? So the idea being, everyone has always heard the old adage about how you should keep your elbows tight or you should have T-Rex arms. And that's not bad introductory advice to beginners because their natural inclination is going to be to stick their hands out everywhere. So we need to give them something to do so they don't just get armbarred in 10 seconds. So we tell them, keep your elbows in tight. That's all well and good. And for a long time, I used to think that that was just universal advice. Keep your elbows in tight. But then I realized it absolutely is not. First of all, there are a lot of things that you can only do if you stick your elbows out. And there's times when you can do it safely, right? Keeping your elbows in tight is only really important if you're in a position where your opponent can grab and manipulate your elbow. If you're too far back or at an angle, you see this with a lot of distance passing in the guard. A lot of those people don't have their elbows in tight all the time because they're so far back that realistically the other person can't do anything to their elbows. And the other thing too is if you want to generate power, at some point you have to extend. If you look at any way that you generate power, whenever you push off something, you do it by extending a limb. If you are just always coiled up in a tiny little ball, you can't generate any force. You're just going to be rolling around on the floor doing nothing. So it's important to understand that a lot of these things, like when we say keep your elbows in tight, well, that's not a universal truth. It's a good default, maybe, about what you should do if you don't know any better, but it's not a universal rule. A big part of staying tight and compact is knowing the opposite, knowing when to explode out of that and to generate force, and then also when to retract back in for safety purposes. And that constant interplay of retract, extend, that's kind of a strategy and a tactics thing that people don't talk about. Like you said, as instructors, we often present the impression that, hey, if you do all of the steps to this move properly, you're going to get it. But in reality, doing the steps properly is usually the least important part of the move. It's about finding the window, creating the opening, finding the timing. And if you get all of those things, then the move just happens sometimes. And that's where the polarities help, is creating those scenarios where success can happen.
Yeah. And I also would say that, there's many times where I tell students, so here's a perfect one, like double legs, right? So here's the technique. Here's how you're going to do the double leg. You'll demonstrate the technique. They'll get all the parts right. But in action, when you're talking about speed and movement and balance and off balance, there are all these other factors that make your shot more or less successful. And sometimes what I end up telling students is I'm like, fuck the technique if you can get the person off balance and drive. It might look a little ugly, but you got it. And we have this thing about wanting to wrap ourselves around the technique. Oh, but it didn't look right. But I'm like, that's not actually the most important thing. What is the objective when you're starting on your feet? Get the person to the ground. So yes, technique matters, but then here are all these other factors that might matter more in the moment. And to your point about, keeping the elbows in or these absolute truths, the other thing is we all learn things initially, usually through imitation, or it was something that was taught to us by our teacher, and we do as we were taught, or we do as we think we should do based on how we, learned the thing. And we do that many times over because that's what we took from it, or that's what we were given. But it's kind of like, as humans develop, we learn rules to break rules. So we need ways to manage how we want to break the rules sometimes. But we can only do that when we know something deeply enough, right? Because in the beginning, anyone learning any new technique, it doesn't matter if you're a new beginner or if you're somebody that's much more advanced. When you're first acquiring the knowledge, you do have to have more sort of like absolute truths in play because you need to understand the form and you need to understand the rotation and why does it work this way? Why does it work that way? But in action, when we're talking about dynamic movement, there's so much more that comes into it. And I find that polarity management can be a really great way to help you organize all of the things that you think you should know or all the things that you don't know about the thing that you want to do. And I was brainstorming on this idea of like how much knowledge there is out there in jiu-jitsu now, so many resources. And one of the most common things that students will say is like, oh man, like I downloaded 7 instructionals, but I have no idea where do I just like start from the beginning and go to the end? And I'm like, everybody learns a little differently. But like, okay, if it's overwhelming because there's so many things to look at, why don't you pick a value that you want to work on? So maybe your value is, I tend to hold on to things too long. So, maybe this idea of holding on to things or letting go. So look at all of your instructionals and think about the techniques that allow you to work on learning to let go a little bit more. And maybe you start organizing a whole game and you start organizing techniques that you want to work on based on these values, as opposed to going through the instructional from day 1 till, day 20, because you can't just log information like that. A lot of times we need a wrapper, we need a theme, or we need a principle, something to wrap our brains around to keep it organized. And so I think for this reason, polarity management could be maybe like really, really helpful for a lot of us who are training out there and we're not really sure where to take our game next, or we're not really sure how to get more juice out of the things that we know. And I think if we start understanding these values and how we can manage them, it'll probably add another level to people's game.
A big part of what this actually reminds me of, and we just had a great conversation about this in our last episode with Giles Garcia, is the push and pull between concepts and techniques. And you've touched on this quite a bit. There's a lot of people who will say that conceptual thinking is the be-all, end-all in jiu-jitsu. And there's other people who will say, concepts don't matter, you got to do 10,000 reps. But honestly, I think that the real answer, the best answer, is you need both. You can't just be a concept person. You can't just be a technique person. To some extent, you need to meld the two. And I think it can be dangerous to identify too much as one versus the other. I mean, this comes up actually a lot with our stuff because BJJ Mental Models is famously pretty much only audio, really. I mean, we got some video here and there, but audio is kind of our jam. And the reason why I like audio is I believe it is superior to video when it comes to communicating bigger ideas. If I need to show you where my hand goes and where my foot goes, video is absolutely better. No question. But a lot of people, they take a look at our stuff and they think, well, how can you teach jiu-jitsu through audio? Don't you need video? And my thought on that is always, well, look, I mean, there are people out there, probably the people giving this criticism, who drop $300 every now and then on an instructional, watch 8 hours of video. How's that working out for them? Is that really helping them? Like you said, the most common use case for instructionals is to go on a shelf, right? No one ever actually watches all of that shit. And even if you do, it's very hard to apply because as we are increasingly learning, especially through things like eco, you can't just show people a thing and have them just immediately be able to reproduce it. The nuance of thinking matters as well. And I find sometimes video can actually be a hindrance if you want to communicate concepts and nuance, because people instinctively want to be told what to do. They want to know, where do I put my hand and where do I put my foot such that I can get this technique perfect 100% of the time? And video is a seductive way to communicate that because you can just do monkey see, monkey do, right? You copy what someone else is doing visually, but we know that that doesn't actually work. The technique is just an example. Really what matters is the concepts, and the technique is just an application of that. So my preference is always use speech, use words, whether they be verbal or written, to share ideas. I like to have no video element because then people have to actually think. And then if they understand that, then they can go off and find the techniques that map to that and figure out the details on their own. That to me is a great example of a polarity when you're kind of blending what are the high level concepts I need to think about and how do I balance those to the on-the-ground techniques that I'm actually doing in the gym or I'm seeing in these instructionals?
Yeah. And this goes back to, I've used this, quote a lot, or I'm going to bastardize the quote, but you had Robert Drysdale on some time ago, and he spoke about this idea that, it used to be the responsibility of the student to learn. It wasn't necessarily the teacher that was supposed to bestow all this knowledge on you and you absorb and bang, like you have great jiu-jitsu. The student actually has to do some work. And somewhere along the way, we started believing, and maybe social media and videos and the internet has something to do with this, but somewhere along the way, we showed up blaming the instructor if we didn't learn the jiu-jitsu. And I mean, look, yes, 100%. There's going to be cases where the instructor is not a great instructor and you don't learn jiu-jitsu. But there's a lot of cases where there's really good knowledge being put out, but the student is not meeting the instructor or the room halfway and taking accountability for what they're putting into it. So I do think that it's important to have people take responsibility for their own learning, and going all audio, making people focus on different senses is really important. I also want to bring to the attention, you think about it, how many people listening have ordered and downloaded an instructional, watched something on YouTube, and then they go to a seminar, maybe in the future. Somebody, either the athlete themselves or somebody like them has deconstructed that move that you learned off that instructional. And when they do the movement to you, you're like, oh man, like I was missing this. Like this was not, my foot was in the wrong place, or I didn't have the grip the right way. Like, what is that? That was like the extra technique that was $500 that they didn't put on the instructional? No, it's the quality of movement that particular individual has developed. And once again, I'm not blaming anybody for not teaching it or by hiding all the secrets. But you think about it, like a highly revered, like a very revered athlete or someone who has been known for developing this particular game, there is something about their movement and what they're doing that everybody else is not doing. And I just don't think it's really top of mind for us to consider that it's those values that make the difference between you performing this technique and some, person that's just learned it on the street off of a 5-minute video. And I say to my students who are teachers all the time, we tend to rush through teaching, right? So like we want to teach what we have to share with the class. Probably in a 1-hour class, you're probably spending really like 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes talking about a technique. But when you think about how long it took you to acquire the knowledge and the movement and for you to be able to execute that technique at will in your own training or in competition probably took a lot longer than 10 to 20 minutes. And again, it has to do with your own quality of movement. So I thought it might be fun for us to maybe break down for listeners how we might do something, how we might go through a polarity map. And I just wrote down, because we've talked about it quite a few times, like this idea of walking through tension and slack, because I think this comes up for everybody. It's also, I think, one of the most obvious polarities that's missing in a lot of people's movement is either too much tension or too much slack. Does that sound like a good idea, Steve?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a very common example too. And also the thing I love about that example is tension and slack work best in conjunction with each other. So it's a good example of a polarity. If you're always tense, that's not great. If you're always loose, that's not great. It is the interplay between them that gives them meaning. And so I'm absolutely eager to unpack this with you.
Okay, so let's walk through some of the upsides and downsides of these values. So I'm going to ask for your help and cooperation and that gigantic brain of yours. If you were to think of positive outcomes or positive results of having tension, what would some of those things be?
Sure. So one positive element is force generation. There's certain times when the only way, actually pretty much every time, anytime you want to generate force, you kind of have to tense up. If you're loose, you just can't push off of something and generate that force. You can't pull on anything. If you're trying to judo throw someone, there's probably going to be a big push or a big pull, and that requires a moment of tension. So I'd say one benefit is force generation. Another benefit is framing and posting. If my frame is loose and I'm not actually attempting to make a strong, solid frame, it's not really much of a frame. So if I'm putting up my hand as a shield or I'm using my knee, I don't want it to be completely loose. There needs to be some tension to hold the structure. So I would say that's another benefit. And then I guess those are the main things. And maybe the third benefit too, and this kind of gets into, it's sort of a bit of both of those already, is if you want to actually finish a submission, you almost always need tension. And that's because of the two things that we already discussed, right? A submission is usually I'm applying targeted force, and I'm also using frames and posts and stuff to make sure that you can't get out of this situation. So that's kind of just an example, I suppose. Is really, I think those two are the main advantages I would see to being tense, is that's how you create force, and that's how you also create frames and posts.
Okay, great. Beautiful. Let's think of some positives, so the upsides of having slack. Why would somebody want to have slack in their body?
Good question. One of the main reasons, of course, is energy conservation. If you are always tense, it's just going to get incredibly difficult for you to be able to perform for a significant amount of time. Another reason is because if you are loose, it's often harder for your opponent to manipulate your body the way that they want. If you ever spar with someone who's incredibly tense, you can feel this. If they're very, very tense, it's easier for me to give them pushes and pulls because they are a rigid structure. So, I mean, especially junior belts, I love sparring with them because they're always so tense, right? It's so easy to sweep them, to arm drag them, to leg drag them, because that tension works against them if they're tense all the time. So there's another benefit to looseness, is it's just harder to control you and move you around. And I'd say the third benefit to being loose is it makes it harder to telegraph your emotional state and your intentions. If someone is tense, I can kind of feel to some extent what's going on in their head, right? At the bare minimum, if someone is completely tense all the time, I know that they are afraid. And that in itself is an advantage to me. But beyond that, if the person is always tense, or if they're tense before it makes sense to be, you can sometimes gauge at what they're going to do next, right? Where they're being tense and how they're being tense gives it away. A great example is if I'm mounted on someone, I am waiting to feel them plant their feet on the mat and begin that big bridge movement, because I know as soon as they do that, I'm going to jump up and I'm going to climb up to a high mount. I use that as an opportunity. So when you feel tension in your opponent, it telegraphs, which I guess is the third reason why being loose can be good, because it makes it much harder to telegraph what you're doing.
Okay, beautiful. So let's think about some of the downsides. Why would it be bad to have too much tension in your body?
In terms of having too much, the main reason is just burning out your muscles. No matter how much of an athlete you are, it's always going to behoove you to relax when you can, because tension, it just requires more energy for no good reason. That's one of the main downsides. The other downside to tension is you're a more rigid structure when you're tense. So it's easier for people to pull you out of position or manipulate you. For example, if your arms are very, very tense, it's going to be easier to arm drag you or to hit judo throws because your arm is a stronger mechanism to pull on, right? It doesn't have as much looseness in it. And then I guess the third downside to being tense is that if you're tense all the time, you can't generate any power. If you're always at maximum tension, you can't really push off of or drive off of anything. In order to generate power, you've got to go from loose to tense. That's how you push off of things. So if you're always tense, you're also killing your own ability to generate force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I also think another common one with too much tension is more at risk for injury, right? Like everything is so rigid that like things will snap, right? The body doesn't move like that. Amazing. Okay. So the last one, let's look at the downsides of being too loose or having too much slack.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the main criticism of a lot of defensive jiu-jitsu is that it often comes across as too loose. If you are just a wet noodle, you're basically not doing much in the way of jiu-jitsu. It's going to be very hard for you to achieve any sort of dominant position. Whenever you see someone playing a primarily loose game, often they're in bottom side control, right? Because it's very hard to be a power top player if you're just loose all the time. So at some point, if you want to get and maintain superior position, you cannot just be loose all the time. Again, our ability to stand upright, to generate force, to move ourselves around requires some tension in the muscles. So looseness is a powerful tool in some situations, but if you're always loose, you just aren't going to be able to move yourself or your opponent effectively. And so again, a big part of the game is being loose until it's time to explode. And that's when you tense up.
Okay. So cannot achieve dominance, cannot move effectively. All right. So this is a good start because we have like 2 or 3 upsides and downsides. When I've done some of these maps on more of like a, personal performance basis, I might be looking at 5 to 8 different types of outcomes. With jiu-jitsu, it may be a little bit less, but we definitely want to have more than one, right? And so this is a good start for us. At this point, I would also say to some listeners, it's also not uncommon to find that one quadrant is easier for you to generate responses to. And a lot of the times that's very telling of like what you're over-focused on. Right. So like if you are finding that you have a lot of results for outcomes for the downside of having too much tension, it could be because that's what you're doing a lot of the time. And likewise, if you find that there's one area where you're struggling to come up with reasons, it could also be because that's an area that you are either burying or not paying enough attention to. So having the opportunity to actually articulate these things and sort of work through your brain and think about, well, what do I do? What do I not do? What are the positives or the negatives? If we don't have answers or we have too many answers, that can often indicate like where we're over-focused. Okay, so it's not enough for us to just say, here are some positive and negative outcomes of these 2 values, right? So we have the upsides of tension, the upsides of slack, the downsides of tension, the downside of slack. This is audio. So if we could imagine a figure 8, right? And then we were to lay a quadrant over that. That's kind of the graphic that we're using when we're trying to visualize what a polarity map looks like. So as the figure 8 flows and the quadrant intersects the center of that figure 8, you're going to have a flow from the bottom diagonal corner of one into the top of the opposite side, which then flows back down and goes to the opposite side. And so this is just sort of like an energetic flow between all four quadrants that are connected together. Outside of those quadrants, we would have what we would call sort of actions and behaviors that we want to employ to get into the upsides of these two values, and or warning signals of behaviors or actions that we see when we're falling into the downside. And this is where I think we can become a little bit more precise about how we can employ situations or techniques in our jiu-jitsu to help us exercise the awareness we have over tension and slack. Okay. So we would want to put these in order. So Steve, I'm going to ask you, on the upside of tension, what's more important to you, generating force or holding structure?
Ooh, that's a really tough question to answer. I don't know if I can say that one is more important than another because it totally depends on the goals, right? It depends on what you're trying to do, and often they kind of come together. How could I identify which is important? What kind of thinking should I be asking myself here?
Well, I mean, I would say intuitively, is there one that you do more than another? Or is there one that you would like to employ more than the other?
Generating force is kind of the whole thing in jiu-jitsu in a lot of ways. I mean, I will take this back to something that Rob Bernanke has talked about. He's talked about his theory of alignment, base, posture, structure. What Rob has always said is that the most important of these is having base. Base being defined as your ability to generate and absorb force. And to some extent, I think I agree with that. You can't really move if you can't generate force, right? To some extent, everything that you're doing, you have to be pushing or pulling off of a surface to move. Having a structure, having solid frames is important, but I think the most important thing is your movement, your ability to kind of get out of positions. I mean, think of bottom side control. Yes, you want to have defensive frames, but it is possible to still get out of bottom side control without frames. There are escapes that you can do that don't use frames really. It's more about movement. Whereas I can't think of any escape that can be done without generating force and using your base to move around. That's kind of a prerequisite for everything. So I guess in this case, I would say the more important of the two is being able to generate force.
Okay. So what we would do next is we would prioritize within each quadrant which of these outcomes is in order, right? So like, which one do we want to focus on first? Because we can't focus on doing 2, 3, 4 things at a time. We want to sort of put our mind to one. So just so that we have the time within this episode to walk through how we would use this, I'm going to use the upside of tension, force generation, as the thing that we want to focus on. Okay. What in your mind would be, and you may not have an answer for this right now, but I'll just sort of openly ask this to the audience. Like, so if the idea here is to generate force, what sort of drills, what sort of movements, and or maybe there's an instructional out there that you've looked at and you're like, man, I really like all of these techniques. I just don't know where to start. This would be a great place for us to start implementing a measurable action or behavior that allows us to demonstrate force generation. So is there a drill? Is there a movement? Is there a technique that you're eager to work on, Steve, that you might fit in here? It has to be measurable. And that's what's nice about jiu-jitsu is it is a physical activity. So we have to do it, right? So tell me about something that comes to mind here.
Okay, let's do something that's very easy and that everyone's going to understand because it's simple. Let's say a double leg takedown.
Okay. And then let's just go to, for the sake of walking through this, I'm going to go to the downside of slack. Okay. And we have on the downside of slack, not being able to achieve dominance or not moving effectively. What is sort of something that begins to happen when we are not able to achieve dominance? Like, how do you know that you're not achieving dominance? Like, what happens in your training?
Generally, the way that I describe it, and this comes up a lot when we're talking about grip fighting and grip management, I define dominance as you have the ability to control the other person, but they don't have the ability to control you. So you see this a lot with grip fighting. It is completely possible to grab a grip on someone that is totally useless because just based on the way you're doing it, you can't actually move or control them. But then on the other hand, it's possible to grab a grip where you can completely off balance someone if you push or pull them the right way. And so I would say for me, that's how I define dominance is you can move and control them. They cannot do the same to you.
Okay. So when you're not achieving dominance, they are moving and controlling you like crazy.
Generally, yeah. Or at least they could, right? I mean, it could also be a dead neutral situation where no one's doing anything and you're just jockeying for position. But if the other person has those dominant controls, they should be the ones who have the ability to dictate what happens in the fight, right? They're going to be the ones who choose what position it goes to and what happens next, whereas you will be the one on the defensive.
Okay. So let's just start here. So when we are in a situation where, let's say, we're getting moved and we're getting controlled and we are definitely stuck on the downside of slack and we are not effectively able to play our game and we can't figure out why, right? So then we might look to the upside of tension and we look at our first outcome, which is force generation. And here we have an activity, double leg takedown. Okay. So what does double leg takedown have to do with I'm being moved and controlled? Well, the double leg takedown is a pretty aggressive movement. And what we can tell ourselves to do is, man, these days where I'm kind of getting stuck on the bottom and I'm being moved and controlled, okay, let me think of ways that I can start to generate force. I got to get up, get out, get on my feet. I'm going to tell myself to get in and do the double leg takedown. How do we do the double leg takedown? How many times? Measure it. Tell yourself, I need to do the double leg takedown 10 times every class. It's got to show up 10 times in all of my rules. Or if I don't get to do it in my rules, I just want to drill the double leg takedown 10 times at the end of class. And what it does is it helps bring some structure to the things that you aren't able to do, right? So the double leg takedown is not the only movement that you can do to create force generation, but it is a movement. It is a technique that's behavioral and measurable that will help you feel force generation, which then will sort of bleed back down to the moments where you are creating too much slack and you're being moved and controlled. Remember what it feels like to hold force. Remember what it feels like to generate force. And by adding all of these different techniques or movements into the results that we've created from the upsides and the downsides, we begin to organize how we should be incorporating these values into our movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And the double leg is an interesting example there too, because ultimately it requires a ton of tension to shoot a good double. You're basically generating a ton of forward moving force toward the person. But the slack actually is an important part of it too, because the most important thing with a good double it's not even really whether you get the penetration step just right. It's more about the entry. And that requires footwork. And footwork requires some degree of slack and some degree of bounce, right? You need to be kind of constantly shifting your balance, moving from one foot to the other. It's kind of a constant alternation between slack and tension, slack and tension. If your legs are always tense, you're basically in one of those old school kung fu positions where you're just strongly rooted on the ground and it's really easy for people to knock you over. You also can't generate a lot of force from there. So a big part of getting a good double is you want to be sort of loose and bouncy on your feet until you can create that opening, until you can get between their arms and you've got a clear shot to their legs. That's when you drop levels and you tense up and you shoot. And so I think that's a good example of how this can work, right? Because when you're in a neutral position and you're both standing, you don't want to be overly tense because you don't want to be the one getting controlled, but you also don't want to be so loose that you're just being completely passive. So a big part of kind of going from a neutral position like stand-up is you wait, you're loose, you're conservative, you pick your shots, and then you explode when you have the opening. So that's kind of how I would see the difference here in this case.
Right. And the other thing too is sometimes you have to train this to do that, right? So if you are generally too loose or too passive in your movement, telling yourself that you have to perform the double leg takedown 10 times at the end of class or 10 times at the end of, throughout practice is also helping you embody a type of force that you're not used to generating. So that in itself will add a different quality to the way that you train, right? Now, what happens when we overcommit? So I became super aggressive. I started doing double leg takedowns to everybody. I'm grabbing onto people. I'm not letting go. So now I've hit the downside of tension. And our first value is burning out, right? So how do we know that we're burning out?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Usually you can feel it, although I think for a lot of beginners, they don't realize they're burning out. They just don't understand that this is an energy conservation issue. But usually it's a physical thing, right? There might be a degree of pain. It might get harder and harder to maintain your grips. You're going to get fatigued. There could be muscle cramps. All of that are indications that you're being overly tense. Or alternately, I mean, from a more tactical standpoint, you brought up the problem with shooting a double and being tense the whole time. A big part of a double leg is as you get close to completion, you actually want to loosen a little bit because you don't want to land on your head, right? You also don't want to put yourself in a position where you shoot right forward into a guillotine or something like that too. So overcommitting, I think, is often an example of being too tense. You see this a lot again with white belts who they try to overcommit to a pass while they're super tense and they just get launched instead. I think that's an example of too much tension and not enough looseness where it matters.
Okay, so here we go. We went from the upside of tension where we were generating force, doing double leg takedowns and grabbing our partners and trying to wrestle them down to the ground and doing a really definitive job, right? But now we've become overzealous in doing this and we've overcommitted and now we're getting fatigued and our grips are giving out. So then we have to look to the upside of slack and to balance all this out. One of the results that you had on the upside of slack was energy conservation, right? And so now we think, okay, to balance this movement out, now I'm going to loosen my grip a little bit. Now I'm going to mold myself around my partner instead of hit them like a 2x4. Now I'm going to try and creep up my partner versus try to pummel them into the floor. And maybe there's a strategy here to get up, or maybe there's a different type of technique that we'd like to employ. Or maybe it's just learning to exercise, like loosen your grip, maybe energy conservation. Maybe the measurable behavior or action is like loosen your grip 10 times in the class, right? Like don't grip things so hard or don't bind the knees together. Don't grab, right? This is a way for us to be much more mindful of how we're moving. And there we've just gone through like one little cycle of that figure 8 in terms of learning how to manage a complex problem and seeing how one value that's very good can be exercised to the point where it becomes problematic. And if we want to rebalance ourselves, we have to look back to the upside and employ some of those actions and behaviors. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it's interesting you bring this up because you've kind of come around to describe a particular type of feedback I like to give partners. It can be very hard for beginners to know when they're being too tense. So one of my favorite things to do to help them develop an awareness of this is to tell them when it's happening to them. So if you are this person where you are struggling and you're constantly feeling like you're just too tense, your muscles are burning out, you're kind of almost freezing up, you're so tense, what can be helpful is to just ask your partner, give me a verbal cue if this is happening, because sometimes your partner can feel it better than you can. And so if I'm sparring with a white or a blue belt and I feel them being tense when it doesn't make sense, I'll just tell them, you're too tense. And what I ultimately want them to do is get to the point where their default state is kind of loose, so they're conserving energy, but when they have an opening, when it's ready to go for something, that's when they tense up and they apply the force. And then when it doesn't make sense to apply force anymore, they go back to being loose and flowy, right? So you're kind of optimizing your energy spend. And if you give people that feedback and they develop that awareness of when they're becoming tense, they're going to kind of gravitate towards that, where their default stance is more kind of loose and relaxed. But when the opening happens, that's when they crack the whip and the force explodes.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that for listeners, this wasn't too complicated. I feel like we did a pretty good job kind of breaking it down. But, like I said, if this is of interest to you, I did not create this. It was something that I was exposed to through David Zeitler, who I've worked with in the past, who is an adult developmental coach. And I believe the paper that I have is called Polarity Management, written by Barry Johnson. And the information's out there. It's well used in a lot of different consultancies, and it's used as a practice to help manage problems in usually corporate situations or self-management situations. But I don't see any reason why we can't use this for jiu-jitsu. And so I am super excited that, you thought that this would be something cool for the listeners. And I'm hoping that people think that there could be some value added by adopting this sort of framework, because jiu-jitsu is complex. And I think it's probably one of the things that we love about jiu-jitsu is that it's not simple. We like to be able to, continue to solve problems and create more solutions to create more problems. And this is, I think, a really useful tool for us to not only organize how we move through things, but also like how we want to introduce new techniques, new concepts, things that we may be working on. It's very hard for us to organize our behaviors in jiu-jitsu because a lot of us go to class and we just think, well, the teacher's going to tell me what to do today. And that's fine. The teacher will tell you what to do. But like I said, if you want to be more accountable for your own learning, this is a really empowering tool for you to become more aware. You're not rejecting anything that your teacher taught you. And in fact, I think you're probably making better use of not only the information that you receive from your instructors, but also all of the other resources, whether they be, other training partners, other schools you've gone to, instructionals that you're looking at. there's so many ways that we can integrate more of the knowledge by structuring it in this manner. And so I really think it's a wonderful tool because, again, it takes these values that have to exist with each other and it teaches us about the upsides and downsides of doing them, which we often don't do. Like we often tend to overvalue something and we hold on to it too tightly. And then it breaks it down into actions and behaviors or warning signals so that we don't override one way or the other. So this was a lot of fun, Steve. And, I know that you and I had kind of brainstormed some other types of polarities and, we'll leave it to the listeners. If this was interesting, we can do another round on it or, we can do a workshop or something like that. But I think it could be a great tool for people who really love to, think about all the different things that they know and think, how do I make the most use of this? How can I be efficient about employing all these things that I understand? And how do I build more awareness around my game?
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Emily. I think that this is a really interesting thought experiment. And I like that it's geared towards breaking people out of this dichotomous thinking pattern. Whenever you hear people say, always do this or never do this, that should usually be a mental cue that you might want to explore that a little bit deeper, because at least in jiu-jitsu, there are very few always and very few nevers. So if you ever hear that, just think maybe this is a time where a polarity applies and kind of digging a bit deeper would help me understand the art a little bit better.
100%. Very cool. Thanks so much for the time.
Most welcome. If people want to follow you or ask you questions, Emily, or work with you, how do they go about doing that?
They can email me. They can go to my website, emilykwok.com, and or you can probably find me on Instagram at Emily Kwok BJJ. I cannot promise that I'm always the most responsive. I really apologize. There are some people that have emailed me and I have not emailed them back because life gets a little busy, but you're probably on my list. And the other thing you could do is you could just keep poking the bear and bothering me until I do respond to you. But I really do want to say, I think it's important for us, when we learn new concepts, when we have things to share with the jiu-jitsu community that can really help a lot of people elevate their knowledge and implement what they think they know or implement the things that they'd like to know. This is one of the beautiful things about being able to teach and share. And so it's hard sometimes to do it one-on-one, and having a platform like your podcast, Steve, is a real blessing because you can get the knowledge out there. People can go, I'm not possessive over the knowledge. People can go look this up themselves, but, reach out to us if this resonated with you and maybe we do something else that would be helpful on a large scale because, I find that there's always a lot of people that are trying to think about how to answer the questions that they have. And sometimes they don't always have the answers available to them. Sometimes their teachers don't know the answers. And an exercise like this and other types of frameworks that I know some of your other guests have introduced can be super helpful in helping them become more accountable for what it is that they're learning. So please reach out. We'd love to hear your feedback. And thanks so much for tolerating an hour with me and Steve.
Most welcome. Thank you for the time too, Emily. As I always do, I will put the links to contact you and check out your website in the show notes, as well as some of those resources that you discussed. I'll also put a link to our stuff. Everything we make lives at BJJMentalModels.com. Getting close to 300 episodes of this show completely available for free. All of them are intended to be timeless and educational, so you should get just as much value out of them today as when we recorded them. Also suggest people sign up for our newsletter, getting close to 10,000 subscribers on that alone. So that's also a great free resource. It comes with expanded notes on the podcast, as well as thought pieces and sometimes even freebies like free instructionals and stuff like that. Kicking it up to the next level, you can sign up for BJJ Mental Models Premium. That's where you get access to our content course loads. We've got a library of over 100 hours, I believe now, of awesome audio masterclasses from really great thinkers in the sport, including Coach Emily here. And on top of that, you also get access to our premium podcasts, also including Coach Emily. So if you want to hear Emily go real deep into the peak performance studies with her co-host Johannan, I definitely recommend joining BJJ Mental Models Premium to get access to that. You also get access to direct coaching from our Black Belt review team. This is easily the most cost-effective way to get this level of coaching from Black Belt world champs around the world. So I definitely recommend checking that out if you haven't already, especially if you want to see rapid gains in your jiu-jitsu and you're just not able to get that kind of time and attention at the gym. So with all of that said, it all lives at BJJMentalModels.com. First week is free, so please do try it out and let me know what you think. But thanks a lot, Emily. Always love having these chats with you. I think this was a good one. Really curious to see how people apply this and what they do to put together their own polarities. I would love to see people's feedback if they go through this process and come up with any interesting findings they want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to see it too.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Emily. Greatly appreciated. Thanks to the listeners as well. Greatly appreciate you too. And we'll talk to you next week. Take care.